Hello there. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to welcome you all back to the second day of our terrific conference on Ecologies of Paper in the Early Modern World, convened on behalf of the Huntington by Caroline Fowler from the Clark Arts Institute and Shira Brisman from the University of Pennsylvania. If you were not here yesterday, my sincere commiserations. You missed some excellent papers, but I'm glad that you've been able to join us today. Just a couple of brief housekeeping announcements. The speakers will each speak for about 15 minutes, and there will be moderated Q&A at the end of each group of presentations. Q&A will begin with conversation, facilitated conversation amongst the panelists themselves, and then we'll take questions from the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. So please do submit questions because we'd like to feed them into the discussion as the morning proceeds. We have sent to all those who were registered by 6 p.m. on Thursday, sent the bios and abstracts of all the papers. So we're going to dispense with formal introductions during the course of the program so that things keep rolling along. I think that's all I need to say. Thank you for joining us. I'm confident that you will learn as much from today's papers as you did from yesterday. Carol, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Steve and your team again for running such a smooth operation. And thank you to our audience for joining us. I know that everyone is a little fatigued by Zoom, but thank you so much for being here. And I don't want to spend too much time with the introduction, so we can get started with our session and our papers. And first up, I think we're gonna swap the papers this morning because Josh Calhoun is having a little trouble with his computer. He has to restart it. And so in order to stay on time, we will get started with Shira Brisman, and I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful co-convener now. Thank you.
Thanks, Caro and Steve and the whole team. And we're really delighted to be hosting this at the Huntington, and so happy that you all could be here. Thanks also to our panelists for their dedicated commitment to this program. Okay, am I zooming well? Can somebody just say yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's all
my
good.
slides. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. My students usually don't tell me until after class when I've screwed something up, so thank you. The title page of a booklet of 6 engravings of designs for jewelry by the Nuremberg goldsmith Wolfgang Hieronymus von Bümmel announces that its contents are intended for other members of the craft. This address appears as text on an animal hide attached to the artist's table, on which his tools also rest. The skin, which has here become a surface for writing, is pinned to the workstation. We see examples of this sort of apron in several engravings that show goldsmiths' shops, perhaps the most well-known of which is by Etienne Delhomme. This type of receptacle was hung above the lap to catch the shavings of gold and silver as the artist refined his forms. Once gathered, the dust could be melted together again and reworked. Bümmel's title page, in presenting the holdings of his booklet by printing words on this satchel, repurposes a container that itself gathers material to be reused again. He thus hints at how to think about the prints as valuable surplus that can be culled and reworked rather than left for waste. Bümmel's booklet may be classified as a genre of printed compilation that sometimes refers to itself as a Kunstbuch, a booklet of models proposed for use by other craftsmen. These were produced by goldsmith engravers, that is, artists trained in metalwork who also made prints. The compilations began to appear in publication beginning around 1540. With increasing abundance over the 16th century, and in inverse proportion to the production of mining and metallurgy in the German territories, which declined over the century's second half, these Kunstbücher gathered together descriptions of objects that were intended, as Bümmel states, for members of their trade. They were also aimed, as could be explicitly stated, for general buyers who collected prints. Johann Theodor de Brie, in one title page, addresses designs for knife handles both to goldsmiths and to Liebhaber, amateur, that is, to anyone who loves art. The prints could thus be put to use at the same time that they could flout the very idea of use. For example, in a proposed design for a pitcher by Matthias Zundt, the dribble emerging from the spout that has not yet hit the ground seems to make manifest the functionality of the vessel, as if to say, you can pour from here. And yet this detail is so unnecessary, so excessive to the demonstrative purpose of the print, that it might almost be understood as undermining the operational aspect of both the print and the vessel it contains. Perhaps what we are being shown is the expression of ooze from the twisted vined flower that is sprouting from a helmeted head. But to get caught up in this ambivalence about utility and this playfulness of imagery is to suppress the possibility that the booklet as a whole may have something to say about the topic of possession at large. Do not be deceived by the discharging liquids nor puffs of smoke emitting from the tufts of monstrous heads. For this genre of Kunspus was the place where artists had their say about what it meant to own a thing. Now, this claim may initially seem outsized for the medium in which it was delivered. But a look at the title pages of the two books which will serve as the foci of my argument today will, I hope, resize the ambitions of the Kunstbücher to their appropriate grandiosity. On the left is the title page for the compilation of Matthias Zundt, an etcher, waxworker, and goldsmith who trained in the Nuremberg workshop of Wenzel Jamnitzer. Zundt's title page, written in Latin and German, proclaims a new art book in which artistic reproductions and images of drinking vessels, serving dishes, and goblets are assiduously presented and printed so that goldsmiths, sculptors, painters, and all artists may practically apply them towards more artful and poetic imagery in their work, issued as a new edition and printed in Nuremberg in the year of Christ 1551. Above this text is a depiction of the fall of Phaeton. From 60 years later, we have the dedication page of the 1610 Neue Groteskenbuch of Christoph Jamnitzer, Wenzel's grandson. So my two samples, while chronologically separated, are in fact descendants from the same shop. Jamnitzer's book is also addressed to a potential patron, Karl Ludwig von Fernberg zu Egenberg, and is followed by a rhymed couplet poem in which Jamnitzer addresses young people training in his field. In the dedication, as Madeleine Filion has discussed in a brilliant article in the Art Bulletin, Jamnitzer compares his inventio, his etchings, to Columbus's inventio, his discovery of the New World. In focusing on these two books as examples, I wish to demonstrate that goldsmith engravers were craftsmen uniquely positioned to comment upon what could be shared and what had to be conserved. Their trade relied on an ethos of transmission and a vigilant attitude against waste. The spirit of conservation pertained to how they conceived of their materials as products of the natural world. It also served as a model to limit the supply of the booklets as a whole. And yet, the booklets gesture outwardly, offering up their contents to an unrestricted audience for potential use. The booklets as a whole then, as we will see, followed a model of contrived scarcity, whereas their contents, the designed ideas within, followed one of limitless abundance. Reliant as they are on metaphors of depletable versus constant supply, the terms of the relationship between property and what we would today call intellectual property were negotiated in the hands of the 16th century goldsmith engraver. Owing to the sustenance of the city's economy upon their precious metal products, which could be substituted for or converted into coin, the goldsmith's trade in Nuremberg was tightly controlled by the council. The patricians of this free imperial city regulated the distribution of labor. To equalize productivity and even out commissions, the Handwerksrecht stipulated that each master could have up to 4 apprentices. As they gained technical knowledge from their masters, apprentices were permitted to produce wax models and etched designs on the surface of the metalwork, as well as prints that could serve as records or models for future inventions. Scratching a needle into copper was work that could be accomplished at night under candlelight, but the fashioning of precious metal into 3-dimensional forms had to be performed during the day and in a workshop whose windows opened onto the city streets. This measure permitted surveillance by authorities and prohibited clipping, skimping, secretive dealings, or other dishonest work. Valuable materials were carefully guarded. Wax was one such protected resource. A design for a candlestick by Matthias Zundt exhibits the already exhausted wax that clings as it slips and congeals into drips, offering up an image of material expenditure. Christoph Jamnitzer too shows the burning down of candles, as well as their imminent snuffing out. In the goldsmith's shop, wax was procured in bulk from chandlers. It could be melted to form a ground covering a plate for etching. Its ductility made wax suitable for the forming of modelli, like the Bacchus in the hand of Christoph Jamnitzer in the portrait of him by Lorenz Strauch. When augmented with resin, it became firmer for use in the lost wax process. In the spirit of conservancy that governed the craft, in 1572, the council issued a new decree announcing that all molds for rings and other jewelry had to be filled with paper instead of wax because it cost less to burn out the former. Judicious management of all components of the goldsmith's process was not just sage practice. It was a code to live by. Conservation of dross began at the mines. As Pamela Long has pointed out, Pinocchio Beringuccio's addressing potential investors and patrons of the art of mining in his Pyrotechnica, published posthumously in 1540, describes how he learned the secrets of using mercury to extract gold and silver from sweepings. He exchanged a diamond ring and promise of 1/8 of the profits in return for knowledge of the technique. In his De Re Metallica, published in 1556, Agricola articulates the process for smelting sweepings that may be gathered from the dust bin and the walls of the forge. In the goldsmith's shop, wastefulness, a trespass of the careless and untrained, was a matter of public concern for which the city would levy fines. Goldsmiths use fire, water, and air. To make the metal malleable required constant reheating and cooling, as shown in these process depicting prints by Lucas Killian. As we have seen, these substances, fire, water, and air, are the extraneous elements to the designs presented in Zundt's prints. The goldsmith's main material, of course, was mined from the earth, and unlike the other elements, fire, water, and air, earth is partitionable. It is limited in supply, subject to appropriation because it is scarce. It is for this reason that land is passed down through generations, establishing social hierarchies through impartible inheritance. But over the course of the 16th century, as feudalism gave way to capitalism, and princes short on cash traded instant coinage for rights to their mines, patrons of goldsmiths tried to secure their commissions as Erbgüter, inalienable goods. They wrote these objects into their wills, insisting that they not be melted down nor detached from the family line. They invested in the idea that gilded silver vessels could be secured in this manner. It was the goldsmith's task to fashion their forms into indications that the supply of materials with which the receptacles were made would never run out. Craftsmen wrought figures positioned at the stems of vessels or carrying containers at their backs, sustaining the fantasy that the precious metal and the labor to procure it will never expire. The owner who grasps these cups lays claim to the wealth of the land. But he also invests in the postulation that vessels can behave like land. This self-conscious allusion to ownership over nature's products and her laborers supported this analogy to inalienable inheritance. With their three-dimensional servantware, goldsmiths fed the fantasy that the earth was ever providing. I'm showing you here a candlestick in the form of a miner. In reality, however, patrons and artists knew that mines could be tapped. Lazarus Ecker, tester of ores and master of the mint, wrote in 1574 that all the earth's metals were created by God at the beginning of time. As Verity Platt has written, this notion of limited supply may be traced back to Pliny, who had portrayed mining as the violent plundering of Earth's womb. Quote, "We penetrate her inner parts and seek for riches in the abode of the spirits of the departed, as though the part where we tread upon her were not sufficiently bounteous and fertile. The things that she has concealed and hidden underground, those that do not quickly come to birth, are things that destroy us and drive us to the depths below." So Pliny's imagined depredation of the earth conceived of an eventual depleted void. In practice, miners and goldsmiths knew that gold and silver were products that the earth could cease to yield. What was naturally regenerative was print. Prints readily spawned further iterations. Prints thematizing their own fecundity, as even early engravings from the 1470s, as those by Martin Schongauer and Israel van Meckenem show. But by the mid-16th century, as they were gathered into booklets presented to other artists, the compilation of designs needed to be made scarce in order to make a profit. If the labor that went into producing these Kunstbücher was going to be worth the effort, they required assistance in limiting their supply. It is for this reason that goldsmith engravers applied for privileges to grant protection from copying to ensure that no one else could produce their booklets, at least for a period of time. The privilege was an authorized restriction that contrived scarcity by limiting production to a single source. Let us read the privilege that was granted to Christoph Jamnitzer for his Neue Grotesken Buch. From his Roman Imperial Majesty, our Almighty Lord, etc., gracious privilege and permission is licensed and authorized to Christoph Jamnitzer, citizen and goldsmith of Nuremberg, and his heirs to print and sell his new book of grotesques, divided into 3 parts and etched on copper, the likes of which have never been seen before. It is strictly forbidden under the penalty of a fine of 10 marks gold, half of which is payable to the imperial treasury, the rest to be paid without fail to Christoph Jamnitzer and his heirs, for anyone, especially painters, engravers, etchers, publishers, accountants, and booksellers, to make copies after the aforementioned book of grotesques within the next 5 years in etching, woodcut, copper, engraving. Nor may anyone sell, transport, or in any method peddle the reprinted work, or else be faced with imperial disgrace, the previously mentioned fine. The multifaceted Jamnitzer and his heirs may by their own power and without hindrance take possession, and such action shall not be considered criminal. All this is confirmed by the privilege of his Imperial Majesty and Charter, sealed with this imperial insignia. So the privilege does not mention designs or ideas, 2 words that I've been using to characterize the prints. It refers only to what is tangible, the booklet and its potential reprints, which, if they were to appear, would become the property of Jamnitzer or his heirs. The privilege was an authoritative device legitimated through the processing of paperwork, something we can see if we heed the call to attend to administrative procedures and their material records that Ashish put forward for us yesterday. The granting of privileges to books followed a model that treated the compiled pages like land, like something that could yield a limited supply and that required legal clarity about ownership. Land, as we have seen, is the limited resource par excellence and the ground for individual possession. In producing both gilded silver vessels and copperplate prints, the goldsmith engraver was fabricating art that operated like land. In the former example, to secure the holdings of the patron or recipient, and in the latter, to yield for himself a bit of remuneration. In the first of his 3 title pages that follow the dedication, poem, and privilege, Jamnitzer again offers his grotesques to all those who love art. I hope it will not fail to yield fruit, he writes, then adds, those who don't like it may leave it. The privilege operates through an analogy that restricts the ownership and the productive capabilities of the booklet. This apportioning of the printed compilation as though it were land is exercised not only in the text, but also in the images themselves. On some of the pages of Jamnitzer's booklet, designs are given boundaries, partitioned as pre-plotted motifs. Allocated images are surrounded by figures that float in the air or take up residence on the ground. This ambivalence about space gives rise to the question of whether the sheets themselves, those white fields that Caro called our attention to yesterday, are open for occupation. The question is staged, as Madeleine Villon has carefully laid forth in her research, in a booklet that begins by likening its inventio to Columbus's inventio of the New World. Across the 60 etchings that comprise Jamnitzer's book, sometimes the page opens up entirely as a pictorial ground. Sometimes the images are allotted bordered spaces, and sometimes they float independently, resisting rootedness in any pictorial ground. What I am advocating is not only that we recognize in these etchings the fecundity of the artist's inventiveness. This is work that has been done and been done very well before me, but also that we recognize the social purpose of the craftsman's own reflexivity about the relatedness of prints to natural resources. It was not until the 18th century that the word property would be used to describe the output of artists and authors. But sometimes language lags behind what images perform and can be slow to lay words to the ordering principles of visual vocabulary. What I am suggesting with these remarks is that we might understand how prints legitimated ownership in the early modern period if we momentarily turn our attention away from signatures and monograms and to the places where the images use natural imagery to suggest what is open to limited possession and what is available for broad use. In securing a privilege, the booklet was able to act temporarily like land, quantifiable in supply and valid as a personal claim. But the ideas within the booklet, the designs themselves, were like the elements of fire, water, and air. These unpartitionable natural substances were referred to in classical philosophy by Justinian, Marcion, Seneca, and Cicero as res communes, communal things, the property of all. Unlike the book, which was tangible, the resources of the mind were non-depletable. The proffering of an idea to another did not dispossess the one who shared it. Goldsmith engravers, salvagers of precious metal shavings, and producers of possibilities to be passed around inside of and beyond the shop understood this principle well. They found in the brandishing of flames, the expulsion of air, and in the flowing of water, the natural vocabulary of inexpendability, having in excess that which would not be diminished if given not only enabled, it obligated the possessor to share. It is Cicero, quoting the Roman poet Quintus Ennius, who puts it thus: A man who kindly shows the path to someone who is lost lights another's light, so to speak, from his own. For his own shines no less because he has lit another's. Now, I cannot say for certain that Zunt had this passage in mind when he etched the flame atop his candlestick holder, nor when he chose to present his title page with an image of Phaeton, the bringer of the world's light. But I would like to suggest that this ethos of the obligation to share non-depletable resources possessed in excess was the ethos of the Kunspus. The evidence lies in the visual and written rhetorical gestures of openness and in 3 words that Zunt puts forward in his Latin text. He offers his booklet ad communem usum, for the common use. This generous proffering of ideas had to meet the qualification that what was being made available to others could never truly be taken from the giver, only added to the recipient. Furthermore, these open gestures for Zunt and for Yamnitzer could only be delivered as embedded within the controlled supply medium of the book. The book, like the gilded silver vessel, longed to be like land. For land provides a condition of ownership that will always seem unstable to those who have it and firm to those who do not.
Thank you so much, Shira, for that generative and thoughtful talk. That was great. Thank you. So next, we're going to segue into a separate set of conditions around scarcity and land, I think. Introducing Joshua Calhoun, who will discuss the transformation of a plant, or rags do not make paper. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Carol, and Shira, so much for putting this together. I also thank all of you for here among the participants for your patience as I was having a very, at this point, familiar experience of staring at a screen and wringing my hands and hoping something would go my way, or something like that. It's been. I'm just going to make sure this is sharing okay. Are you seeing my slides now?
Yes, we are.
Great. Fortunately, I got back in time to hear most of Shira's wonderful talk, and I apologize for the delay. The problem with presenting on the second day of a sort of small gathering like this is, of course, that you find yourself just wanting to completely change everything you've been wanting to say based on the really presentations you've been hearing. I'm really grateful to Ashish and to Cheryl, John, and Jennifer, and Caro, and Heather, and now Shira for just laying a groundwork. I've been really engaged by the questions from the attendees, and I found myself just last night and this morning wanting to rethink parts of this and think about the productive ways that are coming out of our conversation here, this gathering, about how we can reframe the study of especially our archival materials on paper. And so we've done a lot of good work, and I will say that I want to hew to time and also be aware I seem to have lost a number of my notes on my slides as in the kind of blow up on my computer here. So I will be watching the time, and I just want to make sure that we have time for discussion, and I'll be careful of that. The framing devices, I think, a way we think about these papers is so important. One of the things the title of my talk is Rags Don't Make Papers, a way of framing, but I wanted to push it just a little bit in response to some of the other papers. I was thinking especially of a book I read recently, and I'm sure many of you have read, American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. And in that book, she weaves together stories, so many stories, her own stories, other stories. She weaves in art, and she thinks about the space, the page, the white space that we've heard talked about, the blank space, the black on white, and the way that it's not always just the way we think about paper and ink, but not always really an accurate way of thinking about it. And one of the stories, in the midst of one of these stories, a story about in memory of Mark Duggan, She, in quick succession, quotes James Baldwin and Theodore Dostoevsky. She says, she cites the quote, "The purpose of art," James Baldwin wrote, "is to lay bare the questions hidden by the answers." And then Rankin writes, "He might have been channeling Dostoevsky's statement that, quote, 'We have all the answers. It's the questions we do not know.'" Struck by the artistry of what's happening in that moment, the warp and the weft and of how narratives are coming together, the ways of knowing, modes of believing that are artificial, but that are perhaps at some point unpick-apartable, so that they begin to seem natural. We don't know how to ask the questions we need to ask. I've become a little bit preoccupied in during the course of the work. I've started with the ecology of paper over a number of years with the things I don't know how to ask, and I trying to figure out how to ask those questions. I'm preoccupied with it now in this moment of feeling of some national division, right? Where there's a sense that my perception is reality, and I don't, again, always know which questions to ask to understand what other people seem to understand or confidently know. And what's more, I don't know how to help somebody else ask a question they can understand what I know. Moments of, I think, real or perceived scarcity sometimes create especially intense moment around that recognition of what we know and we don't know, what we think we know. And the way that I sort of wanted to think into this today, it's a little bit, I've shifted just a little bit into thinking about the kind of division we saw thinking about with Carol's paper, thinking about, you know, what is exactly paper? If it's bark, I mean, we call bark paper paper. We saw like some in Jennifer's paper, this really there was such beautiful slides set up for the showing this order to disorder kind of cycling. I want to think just about the this framing of community and commodity. I think in some ways there's a way we can think about this paper in this way. So I'm going to flip forward my slides. What I'm going to do is I have five images I want to think through with you, so I want to go quickly through these. I'm going to just talk through these 5 images, how they relate, and how I think they tell a story of community and commodity, and rags not making paper. When I say rags don't make paper, I'm thinking of as you're probably aware of a sort of short poem that sits in most famously probably in Dart Hunter's work on paper. So rags make paper, paper makes money, money makes banks, banks make loans, loans make beggars, and beggars make rags. In that statement, there's a sense of perceived scarcity, and there's also a complete inattention to some of the really important parts of it. I mean, rags don't really make paper, and we're going to talk about that. Oddly enough, I think an interesting place to start is oops, let's see, here we go. Now we're going to go back. Is here with Caliban in The Tempest. The first word here from Caliban, what Prospero calls out in Act 1, Scene 2, "What ho, slave Caliban, thou earth, thou speak." And Caliban replies from within or from underneath, "There's wood enough within." It's sort of an odd claim. There's wood enough within. In Shakespeare's, telling of the story, Prospero and Caliban seem to agree that certain tasks need to be done, but strongly disagree about who should be doing them. Or at least this is how the conflict is typically read. It's a master-slave interaction. The first interaction we witness then is a power play. It's not about the wood at all. It's about who gets to decide when there's enough wood, right? Prospero said, "Go get more wood." Caliban says there's wood enough. Who gets to decide? It's a power play. But what if it is also about the wood, or more specifically, how much wood is wood enough? What if the root of this conflict, or at least a root of the conflict, is not only a human struggle, but a human environment struggle? Caliban's first sentence suggests that he has always learned Prospero's language. He still doesn't understand Prospero's, we might say, drawing from Aldo Leopold, Prospero's land ethic. And this is a familiar term for many because of Leopold's influence on conservation. But Aldo Leopold writes, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we get to use it with love and respect." if we say that Prospero regards the island as a commodity and Caliban regards it as a community, it offers perhaps a new way into that those interactions, right? Where suddenly you have two characters who maybe there is a power play, certainly, but also maybe there's just a complete miss. They cannot understand the questions the other one is asking. In Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England, Bill Cronin writes that once European visitors had arrived, their preconceptions and expectations led them to emphasize some elements of landscapes and to filter out others. Especially, they were looking at pine trees a lot. Most of the early explorers sought to discover what Richard Hakluyt had called merchantable commodities, his 1584 discourse on Western planting, a discourse concerning Western planting. Cronin goes on to write that seeing landscapes in terms of commodities treated members of an ecosystem as isolated and extractable units. So timber products were among the earliest merchantable commodities. And we see in the Tempest this play of wood, a focus on wood, this preoccupation with wood. Unlike explorers and colonists that Cronin writes about, in fact, much more like a poet, Caliban tends to list or itemize many things rather than describe one thing in detail. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But, what is kind of fascinating is we do see a shift in Caliban's language as he begins to understand better and better what kinds of things others are interested in, so that when he finally gets to sort of showing his allegiance to Stefano and also Trinculo, he shifts that language. He talks about showing them every fertile inch of the island. He begins to move it into some sort of measurement system, and he says notably, it's this response to what he said. His first words, he says to Stefano, "I'll fish for thee and get wood enough," as if he now sort of understands what enough might be to a settler or colonist. So. In some ways, I'm just going to let some of these just be in conversation, and I'm not going to do hard transitions because it'll come together in the end. This is not a mistake. Well, it is a mistake in some ways, but I'm also thinking about scarcity, and this was this lovely picture which you're looking at right now is a picture I took at the Library of Congress when I was a grad student. And just to clarify, because there've already been technical issues. I know all you're seeing is what appears to be what should be a picture with a question mark. But that's what I have now, right? Given my resources, where I'm stuck now, given my access to my usual sort of hard drives and where I store everything, I couldn't show a picture that Iris's talk made me want to show, which is an image of James Chalmers' Additions to Plain Truth, addressed to inhabitants of America, containing further remarks on a late pamphlet entitled Common Sense. This was printed in 1766 when Chalmers wished to add to his attack on Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet Common Sense. So the substances that composed white paper sort of literally conspired against him. The printer, Robert Bell, couldn't find enough white printing paper to run the time-sensitive polemical track. Instead of cutting his losses, Bell turned the adversity of his ideological advantage by printing the following on a rectangular slip of coarse blue paper pasted to the reverse of the title page. And here you'll have to, sort of like the course in Henry said, you'll have to let your imaginations do the work. We have an opening with sort of a not particularly good quality white, sort of brownish, tannish paper, and then just pasted on this slip of blue paper. And on this slip of blue paper is printed, "To every purchaser, the impossibility of obtaining white constituted the law of necessity for part of these editions to appear in blue. The philosopher reacheth beyond outward experiences. The patriot surmounteth all difficulties." Here, the coarse blue paper, which is much like brown paper, but most likely made from blue rags, no longer represents a failure of patriots to collect enough undyed linen and cloth to produce white printing paper. Rather, the 11 leaves of blue paper, more than half of the text, represent the tenacity of the patriot writer, hailing the sagacity of the philosopher reader. It's also instructive to read the way the printer thinks about the paper or the colors, where he never actually uses the word paper. Instead, he designates by color and suggests that these editions appear in blue, as if the ideas themselves are embedded in the colored fibers rather than floating in print on blue paper. From the philosopher patriot, we go to the philosopher raptor. This is a just an image, and I do not at all mean to be glib, but do mean to point out this, just sort of when you see something that asks a question or points out something that may be worth paying attention to. Right, cows only eat grass, so they're if you're not able to see this right now, it's got this raptor, and it says the cows only eat grass, so they're vegan. Therefore, I eat vegan steaks and burgers. My colleague in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at UW-Madison, Kathy Middlecamp, who's a chemist, has really gotten me to be asking a lot of times, where do we draw the box? Like the box that we draw, that we say this is what contains this thing. And certainly there's a glibness or a humor here. You'll see sometimes these sort of memes with, I'm a secondhand vegetarian or something like that. At the same time, I think that what's actually catches my attention with this kind of thinking is that it's not unlike what we see in sort of like, Hamlet asking how, a beggar can make a progress through the guts of a king. And so I'm thinking that just as we're sort of thinking about plants making paper, or rags making paper, we realize that it's euphemistic, right? Rags no more make paper than beef makes a burger. The idea is that there's more involved there, right? There's a cow. We would at least go back to the cow. Some people clearly are playing this sort of mind game of going back to the grass, therefore it's vegan. And we could, even if we want to go further, think about communities as opposed to commodities. I mean, technically cows don't eat grass. A microbial community in their stomachs digests it, right? So that we have it's a question of which communities we're paying attention to and which things we single out and itemize. Got two more here, we'll go quickly. This is the Taylor's praise of hemp seed. It indicates, what I like about this is in relation to the Velociraptor is that it indicates this awareness of cultural materials, of the sort of plants that become something else, and how they may be they may persist and still be visible through that. The early paper makers didn't necessarily understand, the properties of cellulose, the chemical properties, and John referred to some of the research that has been done. I mean, a lot earlier than you would think, but on understanding the role of cellulose and paper, and exactly how different fibers, like those images he showed of flax or cotton, respond or differently in the vat. But just here this is praise of hemp seed. There is an attention really to the ways that now poets become commodified in paper. So it's not just so that we lose track of the plants, but then the poets themselves, as John Taylor writes, he says, in paper, many a poet now survives, or else their lines had perished with their lives. Old Chaucer Gower and Sir Thomas More, Sir Philip Sidney, who the laurel wore, Spenser and Shakespeare did in art excel. Forgetfulness their works would overrun, but that in paper they immortally do live in spite of death and cannot die. It's, by the way, the first time that first posthumous name of Shakespeare's name in print, and it gets some attention for that. In fact, one of the panelists, Heather Wolf, has curated a project that there's a good that talks about that, and from which I take this image from Folger's Luna collection. But there's also this way in which, if we're thinking about commodities and communities, is sort of the ways that we begin to understand how the privileging of certain kinds of poets, right, it gets to a place where I'm regularly teaching a large course just about every semester, a large lecture course on Shakespeare, just one single person. The way that commodification can happen, and the way we can lose track of the communities in which those ideas arose. And then finally, I just want to go to this final slide. This is a book. This is it was mentioned yesterday by Caro, and also in Caro's abstract. This is Matthias Koop's. It's the historical substances, and here I've got a copy of it here, which I want to be careful of sort of showing you, but see if you got if I think I can show this to you. The historical substances that are which have been used to describe events and to convey ideas from the earliest date to the invention of paper. This is one of our collection with the Holding History program that I helped to lead. with Sarah Marty, my co-director. And this particular book I really sort of took over my thinking around, it's printed in 1800. And it's the first, it doesn't claim to be the first paper made from straw. I think we're going to hear about some of that on Remore later today. But his claim printed on the title page, it's the first useful paper made only from straw. And at the end of Kunspus's Substances, he adds a brief 7-page, so two sheets with 7 of 8 sides possible printed. He adds a 7-page appendix, which is posed as an afterthought, but stands out to a reader because the sheets are more pale brown than yellow. They're less coarse, and printed on the paper are these words. The following lines are printed upon paper made from wood alone, the produce of this country, without any intermixture of rags, waste paper, bark, straw, or any other vegetable substance. Kunspus had figured out the future of paper making. In some ways, we could say he had successfully produced and printed on paper made from wood alone with no additives. And the paper remains intact in all the editions I've seen. I've seen a lot of editions of this book. Even in 1801, when Kunspus expanded Substances and printed the main part of some editions of paper remade from old printed and written paper, such as recycled paper, instead of on straw paper, the wood pulp paper appendix is still there. Only in the 1800 edition, though, do we find at the end of the volume the small ornament you're seeing here that might well be an emblem of the Substances as a whole. The image of a gravestone engraved with the word Phineas in front of a chopped up tree and a setting sun. The future of paper, as Kunspus sort of accidentally figured out without fully realizing, I think, was to be found in the harvesting of trees. Looking backward from 1800, Kunspus sees how bookmaking brought the world to the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. Looking forward, he sees the possibility of establishing a paper manufacture in England using a substance that was available and abundant. In fact, the whole book is really just an appeal to King George III to gain patents and to protect patents so this work can be done. In bringing these together, I sort of want to just, with these various images, I found myself just wanting to think a little differently than I have been doing in the past, based on the conversations we've been having in this group, about what sort of frameworks allow us to rethink paper. And I sort of I stepped back from what I was originally going to talk about and just began to think about what are the ways that I'm framing paper right now, and how is that productive for the work that we're doing on paper? Because I really found that what was most useful from yesterday was the ways that others were framing and that are going to change the way I look at paper, especially in the archives, and perhaps even at my phone. So the one that really struck me is stepping back and thinking that the ongoing work is about community versus commodity. I'm doing a lot with microbial communities on paper, looking at fungi and thinking about how what else survives on paper and what else it might tell us. But I think that this thinking with stepping back and trying to understand that with a commodity, we're trying to limit the questions we ask. We're trying to make it into a thing that could be held up and sort of neatly understood. And with a community, we're trying to understand that we have no idea what questions to ask, and that by getting in there and doing this kind of interdisciplinary work we're doing here, we begin to notice what we wouldn't have otherwise noticed. And that's where I want to wrap up for today. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, great. Thank you so much to Josh and Shira for those incredibly generative papers that I feel were a model of the ways in which of intellectual generosity and abundance in order to think through these really big questions. And it's also nice because both of you really grounded us, I think, in the question of land and property and materials. And I very much appreciated your arc, Joshua, from wood enough within to the wood of paper. And the ways in which, Shira, you pointed us to the important and complicated ways in which property emerges in the early modern period, and the ways in which it's entangled with the question of the discovery of the Americas, and how that pushes against European ideas of property that had developed since the Roman period. And I think that your final questions, Josh, were just so incredibly generative. Not only the question of perhaps we don't even know the questions that we need to ask, but also both of you really seem to deal with the question of community versus commodity, whether it's community of artisans and goldsmith makers in 16th century Germany, or whether it's microbial communities living on sheets of paper. So I also want to open it up to our other conference participants at this point for discussion. Perhaps if people feel, if we aren't catching you unaware, if you perhaps want to turn on your video, we'd love to see you, I'm sure. But I think that in some ways I would love to open it up and hear more, especially from kind of pull out what you're bringing up at the end, Joshua, in terms of thinking about the archive and the ways in which this tied into some of the questions that came up in yesterday's morning panel with Cheryl and John and Ashish, and some of the conversations that we started having there about how we think about the archive as a site, as a resource and as a site, and the ways in which the archive can be perceived both as a site of scarcity, right? There are voices and communities are absented from the archive, and yet also the archive is the surplus that we engage with and that we can become overwhelmed by. And so perhaps Ashish or John, do you want to start opening up this conversation that Josh started in terms of these questions of the archive and community and commodity? And Cheryl.
I'll just say something, sort of the first thing to come to mind is the more I spent time in the 1930s, which is not a decade I spent any time in ever, in these laboratories where scientists are working on books. To me, the interesting thing is sort of the revelation of communities, right? This idea that like there is bacteria, there are microbes living inside the paper, and this kind of the shock of the discovery of the X-ray as a tool to see through the paper and to recognize the existence of these bodies of living things, I think was was both surprising but also empowering, right? To sort of figure out how you could start to think through what the archive looks like from a different perspective, right? It seems less like crumbling matter and more like kind of pullulating thing. And so I think I was traveling in the direction between both of your papers, Josh and Shira, of sort of thinking about work, sort of like labor, how things, how communities are working, how we often the labor is invisible, whether it's microbial sometimes or capitalist. So I think that's kind of some of what I'm starting to piece together between your papers.
I'm not sure that I'm on board with calling microbes communities. Maybe they are ecologies, but to me, the community requires a social dimension and at least a commitment to figuring out what its boundaries are. So I just wonder about how we're using that term.
I love that, Shira. And I always appreciate this is, Shira, we get to spend a very short time together in Wisconsin. I like this sort of like just the, no, I don't know about that. So I guess one thing I would say is that, I suppose it just depends on to the extent we need these various members of the community to be thinking and sort of intentional agents, because I think we do bring our own microbial. We carry our own microbial community, so to speak, in our own bodies, and so one of the I think darker sides of the biocode ecology that have been involved in, maybe it's on the darker side, but the questions that we have to ask, and I think that some of us here have talked about it, but is issues around privacy, right? That there are microbial community, or the microbes that are present there can be traced back in some ways that I think do raise some questions about, like, do you want it to be known that you were in that archive at that time? And what can they tell us about what kinds of humans we're looking at in terms of just thinking about the ways that we typically break down people into group categories. And so that I think there's some interest there, but I think it's also, it does indicate the kinds of people and even the health of the people who are using the archives in some ways that raise questions about maybe guide us back towards understanding the community. But I don't know. Do you buy that, Shira?
Nope.
Good.
I mean, I guess I'm drawing a boundary because I am interested in social obligation, I guess, and social commitment. And so, as I believe you are too, Josh, and I think maybe we're approaching this from different ways, but I think to me, and I think it was really interesting how this question of borders and boundaries, and I love that you asked the question in your talk, where do we draw the box? Because of course, this is something I'm really thinking about with my print. So it really very much in this spatial way is like, what does it mean for a print to have a boundary, and what happens when that border is defined or isn't defined, or when the print is ambivalent about whether or not it's sustaining a ground. I think that let me just say, sort of in the history of art, this question about the pictorial ground has really been developed through modernism and painting, and is really underdeveloped in terms of the history of print. But I don't know. Like privacy is something that I've worked on in my research on letter writing, and something that I am interested in the way that it includes and excludes people. But I guess to me there is a limit to how much biological work and scientific work I'm willing to do on the materials.
Yeah, well, it's so useful to think like just where you draw the box and why this. Again, so much credit to you and Kara, but this is so generative to have to say, have that question, right? Because I've been working with a lot of people who's like, oh yeah, of course, microbial communities, like that's super important, right? And it's also really important to come in and say, well, I don't know if that's a question we want to ask. And thank you.
I wanted to ask a question which is inspired by this emphasis on the relationship between communities and commodities. And I feel as if the reason, partly why I think this is interesting, is that the idea that there is this unexcavated, history, also I think puts me in mind of Ashish's discussion yesterday of the fact that within these histories of paper are actually these obscured histories of paper. And one of the things that I feel as if this issue is raising for me is it makes me wonder, Shira, about the relationship in your talk between the prints that are showing labor by people in a workshop and the prints that are obscuring labor, or else kind of euphemizing it when they show us putti, who are sort of, not actually exerting any labor, but somehow kind of magically bring things that have been labored on into existence. And I know you're not surprised to hear me ask this question, but I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yes, Nina, that is wonderful. I think my concern is that the putti have gotten in the way of, because they have they trigger an association with playfulness, which is how these prints are often talked about, which I worry masks some of the very serious and socially consequential issues that are being worked out in the terrain of these prints, about possession and about ownership. And so I think that's what I really like the question, because I think it reminds me how sort of distracting these elements can be, and I think this sort of insouciance about labor is actually quite sophisticated. And so if you look, for example, at Yamnitzer's his introductory poem, he says quite flippantly that these were not difficult for him to produce. He calls them kind of, he has like a diminutive ending on, so he calls them kind of shitty or crappy. And this is something that Madeline has talked about. His own sort of self-deprecation about his prints, I think, is also, you know, a really kind of allowing himself to deliver the blow. And so what is the blow? I think the blow is that he knows, as his colleagues did, that he was trying at once to produce a booklet that was undermining the system, but also legitimating it. And that's why I think that the idea of ad communem usum, the idea of an open gesture, of something that could be used by everyone, had to be restrained very tightly into a format that was really highly regulated.
It seems that also Sujata has offered a comment in the Q&A in response to the microbial community, and she says, here's a dilemma. We fight so hard for bodily autonomy that to think of ourselves as a porous collection of microbes, and with our second genome, more important than our first, is to risk restricting or losing the hard-won bodily boundaries that we already have. And so, again, if we think about what Shira is talking about in terms of the ground of the page and Josh's project, it seems that in some ways, one of the questions that's coming out of both of your works in terms of rethinking paper is that, like the body, we perhaps don't know where to draw the boundary for paper itself. As an object, it might seem obvious where to draw the boundary, right? It's an 8x11 sheet or whatever, but that in fact, perhaps we don't know how to draw the boundary of paper, or perhaps we don't know how to define it as a 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional object, or that, like our own bodies and the ways in which we unintentionally leave behind particles of ourselves. Perhaps we are also kind of struggling with this definition.
I love that, Caro, and I just want to acknowledge, hi Sujata. Sujata was actually one of the first people who got me thinking about the privacy around some of the bioecological work back at a Shakespeare conference in New Orleans, with a question that you asked. So thank you, and I hope that I'm glad to know we can still keep talking about that. The stuff we leave behind. I was also thinking about then this. Again, sure. I didn't miss. I'm sorry. I didn't get to hear the beginning of your paper as I was screaming at my computer. But something that I heard that really struck me is this question of like Prince legitimating ownership, but sort of the limited possession of the natural world, and how the idea of the trying to quantify or own or think of the book as a landscape. If I was understanding you correctly, and where I think again this question of boundaries, where we draw the boundaries, and I wonder if maybe we could think about that other types of non-human communities. Maybe there's a way of thinking then about what non-human communities, how they, rather than sort of blurring the boundaries, invite us to create those boundaries. And I'm thinking of learning how much sort of skin we slough off. It becomes dust, right? That is. It can be essentially food for microbial communities, right there. In some ways, we're feeding the books that we read, and so that microbial community in and of its own right, to use a language like a microbiologist used to use, microbial community, it may be separate. And maybe actually there's a way towards thinking about the boundaries you're thinking of, the what's quantifiable and what's not, what the limited possession that's there.
And what's traceable to a source. I mean, I think this is
yes.
This is I think this question of sort of like what instigates the tracing of something to us. This is really an early modern problem, right? Or early modern question. is
Yeah.
what will instigate the quest for a source, and what and what sort of cuts off that form of research. And I think, you know, in the project that I'm dealing with right now, what's really interesting is in this in the conversations around Roman law and customary law and how they bump up against each other and how they are reshaping each other. There's this very interesting use of old, of what it means for something to be old, because customary law begins to be legitimated because it's old, right? It's so old that we can't pinpoint it to a source, which is very sort of interesting, again, you know, to see that bumping up against, you know, the humanists who are bringing classical sources into modern times and adapting them. And so what I find very interesting about the philosophy, the Ciceronian, if you will, philosophy of the obligation to share in a to share things that don't diminish in supply if one shares them, is that this had not yet entered. This is pre-Grotius, so this is before this. These conversations really make it into how law is being thought about. It's still, I think, in the realm of philosophy. But I see the artists kind of working through it before it even sort of makes it to the jurists.
Yeah.
Well, we're now at 1:25 Eastern Standard, 10:25 Pacific Standard. So we're running a little late, which is fine. And I think we're gonna take a break and we will reconvene in 15 minutes at 10:40 or 1:40 or I can't do the math, but throughout the various time zones. And thank you to our panelists. Those were really wonderful papers. And I myself feel a little overwhelmed by the abundance of ideas. And I look forward to seeing you all again at 10:40.